Today, I'll be refuting that standardized testing has a negative effect on public schools. The arguer's first secondary claim is that standardized testing negatively affects students. Their second claim is that standardized testing negatively affects instructors. And their third claim is that standardized testing is only for it's not for educational benefits, only for political and economic benefits. Now for the first claim, I'll be challenging the reasoning of the evidence and how it doesn't really support the main claim. For the second claim, I will challenge the evidence that was provided by showing that it really wasn't as significant as the argument would have you to believe. And finally, for the third claim, I will be providing expert testimony that goes against the entire main claim. Okay, so the first claim was that the tests negatively affect students. Now, a majority of the evidence used to support this claim was about how the tests tend to make the students more nervous and anxious, but other than that, there was no real reason to link the negatively impacted students to how that then negatively impacts the public schools. So that evidence was just mainly about the students, which would support that it negatively affects the students, but doesn't really lead to how it negatively affects the schools. And there was another piece of evidence that was provided, and it was about the United States dropping from 18th to 31st place in some math assessment, in international math assessment. And it was implied that this was due to standardized testing, but however, there was no evidence provided that it was standardized testing that caused this downfall. So I believe it's a little bit too big of a leap to say that standardized testing caused America to go down in the math assessment. Now, the second claim states that standardized testing affects educators. Now, the evidence used to support this claim was that teachers in Atlanta were gathering together to change their students' answers of these tests to the correct answers. And in the outline of the arguer, but not the speech, it cited that there were 178 teachers and administrators from 44 public schools that were found to be cheating. Now, this sounds like a lot, but according to Atlanta Public Schools, which is the main school district of Atlanta, as of 2018, there are 2,959 teachers in the entire district. This means that only 6% of all the teachers in the district were cheating. Now, I think that if standardized testing was really negatively affecting the teachers to a high degree, there would be more people cheating, not just 6%. Now, the third claim is that standardized testing is only for economic and political gain, not for educational purposes. Now, I'll be focusing more upon the educational purpose, or refuting that using experts' testimony. So, Latasha Gandhi, who is the Minnesota Program Director for the Students for Education Reform, believes that standardized testing is actually very useful. It provides us with information about how students are doing across the board, and it allows us to gauge and assess students' levels from school to school. Now, she says that they can, referring to the students, they can and must take the test so we know if they're mastering the critical skills they'll need to pursue the college and career of their dreams. Now, to me, this seems like very high praise for somebody who is part of an organization that specifically advocates for justice and fairness in public schools. So, in conclusion, I refuted the claim that standardized testing negatively affects public schools. The three secondary claims made were: one, standardized testing negatively affects students; the second one is standardized testing negatively affects educators; and the third one is standardized testing standardized testing is only for economic and political gain, not for educational purposes. Now, I showed how the first claim doesn't really relate to the main claim because it was more focusing on how it affects the students, but there was no leap telling how the students being affected then negatively affects the schools. And also there was no evidence supporting the claim that it was due to the standardized testing that America dropped from 18th to 31st place in the math assessment. For the second claim, I showed how the number of teachers that were caught cheating were insignificant, and because it was insignificant, that means it's probably not as big of a deal as the argument would originally have you believe. And finally, for the third point, I provided an expert's testimony in favor of standardized testing and its benefit, and how that goes against the main claim in general. And I want you to keep in mind that this person is, she is part of an organization that specifically advocates and fights for justice and fairness for students in public schools. Thank you.
All right, Cameron, there's a little bit of an issue that's not a big deal, but probably you want to pay attention to it. You're over-organizing. You remind us what the advocate's claims are, you preview your responses, you come back to the advocate's claims, you give your counterclaim, at the end you repeat what your responses were, and you explain why they matter. Very thorough, but perhaps a little bit redundant, okay? So you can probably simplify. Tell us what the advocate's claims are, that part's fine, and then make your counterclaims as you're responding to those points. I don't think you need to preview a second time. And then you can do an internal summary on the individual points, that's probably okay. At the end, I think you need to make your summary a little bit shorter. It just really feels like you're covering the same territory again. It's a second round of the same thing. Now, on the arguments themselves, on the first point, most of what you've got here is a challenge to the evidence that the advocate's presenting. You're suggesting that their information is a little bit thin, the notion that students feel stress because they're being tested. There's no demonstration that that has a negative impact on their performance, their long-term ability to be effective learners. It doesn't say they get so stressed that they have little heart attacks when they're 12 years old and, that kind of thing. So I'm sorry. I probably sound like an old curmudgeon about this. My goodness. School was stressful? Imagine that. That's so hard to believe. Have you never been to a gym? Don't they have that sign in there? No pain, no gain. That was my educational advisor's philosophy. If you weren't struggling, if it wasn't hard, you weren't learning anything. I'm sorry that sometimes it's a little bit tough. The notion that students sometimes get nervous about taking a test, that's what prayer's for. Take care of it that way. Jiminy crickets. I like the argument that you have on the last point, which says the reason that we're using these tests is to assess students and figure out what help they need. We got to figure out where to spend our time and money and help students. If we don't know what their strengths and weaknesses are, we can't do that effectively. I think that works pretty well with both that first point and the last point. On the second point, there's not any separate evidence that you have except for the statistical information. I do appreciate that you bothered to figure out how many public school teachers there are in the Atlanta School District, so you could try to diminish the total number that were participating in this cheating thing a little bit. And 6%, that's relatively low, I guess, but it still seems kind of high. I mean, obviously, that means 94% weren't involved, or at least 94% weren't caught. I don't know that means that they were all on the up and up in this particular situation. And by the way, and that's just in Atlanta. We don't know that this happened anyplace else. I think that's another press that you could be making. And the notion that this is something that's common, I think there's a little bit of a problem here. The other thing that might be argued, and I don't know, we'd have to look at this particular thing, were they in fact changing students' grades or were they trying to assess them more effectively? There might have been an argument that suggested that that's really what the teachers were doing, not so much that they were getting together, how can we change the grades, but saying, we need to test these students differently because we're not getting the results that indicate what they've actually accomplished. I don't know. I'm not trying to defend the teachers there. If they were in fact caught cheating, they were caught cheating. I think there are other ways to diminish it. You made one effort to diminish it. I'm just not sure that there aren't other ways that you could diminish it. And then I think on the third point, where you suggest you don't really talk about any of the advocates' evidence on whether or not there's an economic or political basis on this. You just have the one counterclaim, which I think is the good counterclaim to be making here, that there is a utility to having these tests, that they help us accomplish something. Now, if you had a little bit more evidence that showed that happened, that would be helpful. You kind of dismiss the notion that our test scores went down in some way. You suggest, I don't think that, that was on the first point, that the math assessment went down. I'm not sure that the advocate was suggesting that was the case, but it certainly sounds like that might be an argument that responds to your point. In other words, we've been doing this assessment and it hasn't gotten better. that undermines your argument a little bit here. So if this was a debate and we were having that discussion, that would be the thing that the advocate would come back and say, well, you say we're using all this information to do better, but we've had these tests in place for 20 years and we've gone down 20 points in the rankings on this thing. Doesn't sound like the tests are working very effectively. So even though I think you've got the right argument on this particular point, I think you're missing how it fits into the argument here, and there's more to it than that, and maybe some other things to respond to. All right, thank you.